Welcome back to Sleeping History Dreams. Tonight, we step into a real moment from the past, through the lives of the people who lived it, the places they walked, and the records they left behind. Settle in and let the story begin. On the cold night of December 16th, 1773, the stillness of Boston Harbor was shattered by the sound of splintering wood and the shouts of men. Clad in the disguise of Mohawk Indians, a group of colonists moved stealthily toward three ships anchored in the dark waters: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Their mission was singular and defiant: to rid the harbor of the tea that had become a symbol of British oppression. As they approached, the moonlight glinted off the crates of tea, their contents worth nearly £10,000. Silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the soft lapping of waves against the ship's hulls and the muffled voices of the men, who were fueled by a mix of anger and resolve. Samuel Adams, watching from the shadows, whispered, "This is a masterful display of resistance." With a nod, the men sprang into action. They swiftly boarded the vessels, no time to waste on hesitation. The first crate was pried open, and the pungent scent of dried tea leaves wafted into the chilly night air. One of the men, a young carpenter named George, let out a fierce cry as he hurled the first box overboard. It splashed into the harbor, sending ripples across the water. Soon the rest followed, crashing into the ocean like a symphony of rebellion. By the time the last crate was tossed into the depths, over 300 chests had been destroyed. The water turned dark with the remnants of the tea, a stark contrast against the moonlit waves. The sounds of the night mingled with the splashes, as if the harbor itself was rebelling against tyranny. One man, John, paused for a moment, catching his breath. "We've done it," he said, exhilaration and fear competing in his voice. But that triumph was fleeting. As the men began to retreat, the distant sound of drums echoed ominously through the streets of Boston. The British soldiers would soon respond. The mood shifted as fear replaced elation. The true cost of their actions loomed large. A confrontation with the might of the British Empire was inevitable. But to understand how we got here, in the early 1770s, the American colonies were a powder keg of discontent, each colony simmering with its unique grievances against British rule. The echoes of the French and Indian War still reverberated in the streets, having left an indelible mark on colonial society. The war, which ended in 1763, had imposed a heavy financial burden on Britain, leading Parliament to impose a series of taxes on the colonies. Among these was the Stamp Act of 1765, which angered many colonists, including Samuel Adams, a prominent figure in Boston. Known for his fiery rhetoric, Adams became a leading voice against what he deemed tyrannical taxation without representation. He boldly declared, "The rights of the colonists are the rights of man," igniting a fire of resistance that would soon spread throughout the colonies. Life in Boston was busy and vibrant. The streets bustled with merchants peddling their wares, from the finest linens to the pungent fish brought in from the harbor. Shipwrights labored hard to repair the vessels that had weathered the Atlantic storms, their hands calloused from the relentless work. The air was thick with the scents of salt water and smoke from the taverns where men gathered to discuss politics and the latest news. Yet beneath the surface of daily life, tensions simmered. The presence of British soldiers, sent to enforce the unpopular laws, was a constant reminder of the growing divide between the colonies and their mother country. In this charged atmosphere, the Sons of Liberty emerged. Formed in response to the Stamp Act, this secret society of patriots included men from various walks of life, united in their desire to resist British oppression. They held meetings in back rooms and basements, their discussions filled with fervor and determination. Among their ranks was John Hancock, a wealthy merchant known for his bold defiance. Hancock's signature would become synonymous with rebellion, as he famously signed the Declaration of Independence with an audacious flourish, declaring to King George III, "There, I guess King George will be able to read that." As the years progressed, the situation became increasingly dire. The Townshend Acts of 1767 further exacerbated tensions, imposing duties on everyday items like tea, glass, and paper. The colonial response was swift and unyielding. Boycotts of British goods became common, with women forming their own groups, known as the Daughters of Liberty. to produce homemade goods and support the cause. They would gather in homes, spinning wool and weaving cloth, determined to demonstrate that they could provide for themselves without British imports. One such woman, Mercy Otis Warren, penned powerful pamphlets and plays that stirred public sentiment against the British, her words resonating with many who felt their liberties were under siege. By 1773, the mood had turned from simmering discontent to outright defiance. The Boston Tea Party, a direct response to the Tea Act, was a pivotal moment. On December 16th, a group of colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships anchored in Boston Harbor. They were determined to send a message to the British Crown. As they hurled over 300 chests of tea into the icy waters, the act was not merely about the tea itself, but a bold statement against taxation without representation. The tea was valued at nearly £10,000, a staggering sum that illustrated the economic stakes at play. The Sons of Liberty, who had orchestrated the event, were well aware of the potential repercussions. As news spread, it ignited both outrage and admiration across the colonies. Samuel Adams proclaimed, "This destruction of the tea is the most magnificent event that has happened in America." Yet the British response was equally swift and severe. In reaction, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts in 1774, known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, aiming to punish Massachusetts and reassert control. Boston was effectively placed under siege, its harbor closed to trade until the tea was paid for, leading to widespread desolation and despair. In the face of adversity, the spirit of rebellion only grew stronger. Meetings were held in taverns and town squares where men like Adams and Hancock rallied the populace. They spoke of liberty, of rights, of a future free from tyranny. The First Continental Congress convened in September 1774, where delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered to address their grievances. The resolve was palpable. They agreed to boycott British goods and to form militias, preparing for a fight that many sensed was inevitable. As winter descended on Boston in early 1775, the atmosphere was fraught with anticipation. The Sons of Liberty had become a formidable force, uniting disparate voices into a singular cry for freedom. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, discussions filled the taverns, and plans were forged in whispers. The British soldiers stationed in the city could feel the tide changing. Tensions crackled like electricity in the air, a prelude to the storm that was about to break. The stage was set for conflict, and the people of Boston stood at the precipice. They were not merely subjects of a distant king, they were men and women with hopes, dreams, and a fierce determination for self-determination. The Sons of Liberty, with their secret meetings and daring actions, embodied this resolve. They were the harbingers of revolution, their hearts beating in time with the pulse of a nation awakening to the call of liberty. In this moment, history hung in the balance. The ideals of freedom and resistance were not just abstract concepts, they were the lifeblood of a burgeoning identity. The world was changing, and those who dared to stand against oppression would soon find themselves at the forefront of a revolution that would reshape their lives and the future of the colonies. In the early months of 1774, the air in Boston buzzed with a palpable sense of unease and anticipation. The aftermath of the Boston Tea Party had sent shockwaves through the colonies, igniting fervent discussions in taverns and homes alike. Samuel Adams, a key figure in organizing the rebellion, declared, "The die is cast. We must now stand together or fall together." His words, echoing through the cramped spaces of the Green Dragon Tavern, resonated with the growing conviction that the colonies must unite against British tyranny. As the winter chill lingered, resistance organizations such as the Sons of Liberty gained momentum. This group, formed initially to oppose the Stamp Act, had transformed into a formidable network advocating for colonial rights. Their meetings became increasingly bold, focusing on strategies to counteract British measures. The rhetoric was charged with a sense of urgency. They were not merely reacting to oppression, but actively crafting a vision of independence. A pamphlet circulated among the members proclaiming, "The time has come for us to assert our rights as men and as Americans." This was more than a call to action, it was a declaration of identity. Meanwhile, the British government, caught off guard by the audacity of the Tea Party, scrambled to reassert control. In March 1774, Parliament enacted the Coercive Acts, measures designed to punish Massachusetts for its defiance. The Boston Port Act, which closed the harbor until the lost tea was paid for, struck at the heart of the city's economy. Merchants faced ruin, while residents braced for hardship. Yet rather than quelling the discontent, these punitive measures served only to galvanize the colonists. Mercy Otis Warren captured the sentiment of the time when she wrote, "An act of tyranny is a call to arms." The First Continental Congress convened in September 1774, a historic gathering that marked a turning point in the colonial struggle. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia to discuss a collective response to British aggression. They deliberated in a spirit of unity, despite the diverse interests represented. Patrick Henry's passionate declaration, "Give me liberty or give me death," fueled the resolve of the Assembly. They crafted a series of resolutions, urging a boycott of British goods and calling for a second Congress if their grievances went unaddressed. As tensions escalated, British troops were ordered to occupy Boston, further inflaming the situation. The presence of soldiers in the streets was a constant reminder of the looming threat. The soldiers, in their red coats, became symbols of oppression, their very existence provoking animosity among the colonists. The atmosphere grew increasingly hostile, with skirmishes reported between soldiers and civilians. In April 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, igniting the Revolutionary War. The conflicts at Lexington and Concord were not mere skirmishes. They represented the culmination of years of rising tensions. Colonial militias, emboldened by the call to arms, engaged British forces in a confrontation that would reverberate through history. The phrase, "the shot heard round the world," became synonymous with this event, highlighting its significance as the spark igniting a broader revolution. Eyewitness accounts described the chaos of the early morning as farmers and townsfolk took up arms, driven by a mix of fear and defiance. One participant recounted, "We were not soldiers, but we stood for our rights. We had no choice." In the months that followed, the colonists began to perceive themselves not merely as subjects of the British Crown, but as a separate entity, united by a shared cause. The formation of the Continental Army under George Washington signified a commitment to this newfound identity. Washington, a Virginia planter and military leader, was entrusted with the command, his experience and reputation garnering respect across the colonies. He accepted the role with the understanding that the struggle ahead would be arduous. In a letter to Congress, he stated, "The eyes of all America are upon us," indicating the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The war brought hardship and sacrifice, but it also sparked a wave of revolutionary fervor. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, published in January 1776, struck a chord with a populace eager for change. Paine argued vehemently for independence, stating, "A government of our own is our natural right." His words inspired countless colonists, illuminating the path toward a vision of a republic free from monarchical rule. As the days stretched into months, the struggle became more than a fight against taxation. It transformed into a quest for self-determination. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, crystallized these aspirations. The document articulated the belief that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. It was a bold assertion that would redefine the relationship between government and the governed. Yet amidst the triumph of declaring independence, the realities of war loomed large. The battles of Bunker Hill and Saratoga tested the resolve of the newly formed nation. The winter at Valley Forge in 1777-78 would challenge the endurance of Washington's army, with many soldiers succumbing to cold and hunger. The sacrifices made by these soldiers reflected a deep commitment to the ideals of liberty and self-governance, solidifying their belief that they were fighting for a future free from tyranny. As the revolution unfolded, the colonists lived in a state of uncertainty, grappling with the sacrifices demanded by their cause. They believed they were on the cusp of something monumental, yet the path ahead was fraught with peril. The ideals of liberty and independence fueled their determination as they navigated the tumultuous landscape of war. each event serving as a catalyst for their emerging identity. In the quiet moments between battles and proclamations, the dream of a united America began to take shape, held together by the shared hopes and dreams of those who dared to envision a future beyond the grasp of British rule. The foundations of a new nation were being laid, and in that struggle, the very essence of what it meant to be free was being forged. On April 19, 1775, the sun began its ascent over Lexington, Massachusetts, casting a pale light on a quiet town that was about to become a crucible of war. That morning, the British Army, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, embarked on a mission to seize rebel arms stored in Concord. The tension in the air was palpable, as whispers of a confrontation had spread throughout the colonies. In response, the Minutemen, a group of colonial militia, had gathered under the leadership of Captain John Parker, who, upon hearing the news, understood the stakes. He famously declared, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." As the British troops marched into Lexington, they were met by about 70 Minutemen. The sight of these determined men standing resolutely against the might of the British Empire was historic. Just before dawn, a shot rang out, referred to as the shot heard round the world. It remains unknown which side fired first, but the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. 8 colonists lay dead, and several more were wounded. The British, having demonstrated their resolve, continued their march towards Concord, emboldened yet unaware of the firestorm they had ignited. In Concord, the colonial militia assembled rapidly, bolstered by the news of the skirmish at Lexington. Among them was Colonel James Barrett, who had hidden the military supplies in various homes and barns, a tactic intended to thwart the British. As the British forces arrived, they found the supplies had largely been moved. Feeling the weight of their authority slip, the British troops began to burn what remained, an act of destruction that stoked the flames of rebellion further. The confrontation escalated as colonial militia members gathered at the North Bridge in Concord. On that fateful day, April 19th, the British faced a well-formed resistance. When the British soldiers crossed the bridge, they were met with a volley of fire from the Minutemen, resulting in the deaths of 3 British soldiers and injuries to several others. The colonial forces, no longer just a ragtag group of Minutemen, had transformed into an organized militia determined to stand against oppression. The conflict at Concord signified not merely a battle over supplies, but a decisive moment wherein the colonists declared their willingness to fight for their rights. As the sun climbed higher, the British troops, realizing they were vastly outnumbered, began their retreat towards Boston. The Minutemen, fueled by the adrenaline of their newfound courage, pursued them along the route, firing upon them from behind trees and stone walls. By the end of the day, the British faced casualties totaling over 270 men, while the colonial forces had sustained about 95 casualties. The human cost was staggering, but the resolve of the colonies had solidified into an unmistakable call to arms. The aftermath of April 19, 1775, reverberated throughout the colonies. News of the skirmishes spread like wildfire, igniting fervent discussions in taverns and homes. Samuel Adams, a key figure in the revolutionary movement, proclaimed, "This is the beginning of the end of British tyranny." The events at Lexington and Concord galvanized support for the cause of independence, drawing in not just soldiers but civilians who had previously stayed on the sidelines. It was no longer an issue of taxation without representation, but a full-blown struggle for liberty and self-determination. In the following weeks, the Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, where delegates from all 13 colonies gathered to discuss their course of action. Among them were well-known leaders such as John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, who debated the necessity of a unified military response. The intensity of their discussions reflected the gravity of the situation. On May 10, 1775, they formed the Continental Army, appointing George Washington as its commander. Washington, a veteran of the French and Indian War, understood the enormity of his task. He wrote in a letter to a friend, "The great object is that every man should be prepared to act." Meanwhile, the British government was equally resolute. King George III, upon hearing of the events, declared the American colonies to be in a state of rebellion. His response was swift and severe, as he ordered reinforcements to quell the uprising. On June 17, 1775, the first major battle would unfold at Bunker Hill, where the colonial forces would face British regulars in a test of wills. The battle would not only be a military engagement, but a testament to the determination of the colonists to stand firm against their oppressors. As the crisis unfolded, the human cost continued to mount. By the end of 1775, the conflict had already claimed thousands of lives, both soldiers and civilians. The once peaceful towns became battlegrounds, and families were torn apart as sons and fathers took up arms. The harsh realities of war struck many, as noted by a soldier who wrote, "We are in the midst of a great struggle, and the cost of freedom will be heavy." The Revolutionary War had truly begun, shifting from protests and petitions to bloody confrontations and strategic maneuvers. Each decision made, every life lost, pushed the colonies closer to a collective identity forged in the fires of resistance. The resolve among the colonists grew stronger with each passing day, transformed by the harsh realities of conflict into a united front against British tyranny. As dusk settled on the horizon, the echoes of gunfire and cries for liberty filled the air. The human cost was staggering, but the flame of revolution had been ignited, destined to burn bright as the struggle for independence unfolded across the 13 colonies. On June 17, 1775, the air in Charlestown, Massachusetts, was thick with tension and the scent of gunpowder. The Battle of Bunker Hill, though technically fought on Breed's Hill, marked a significant turning point in the American Revolution. The colonial forces, primarily composed of farmers, tradesmen, and militia, faced the seasoned British Army head-on in a demonstration of resolve that would reverberate throughout the colonies. Among them stood Samuel Adams and John Hancock, both of whom had passionately advocated for independence, now witnessing their words translated into action. The colonial troops had fortified their position overnight, constructing earthworks and trenches to defend against the inevitable British assault. As dawn broke, they prepared for a confrontation that would shape their destinies. The British, led by General William Howe, advanced with over 2,000 men, their red coats a stark contrast against the green backdrop of the hills. The tension was palpable as both sides braced for the clash. The first shots rang out around 3 p.m. when Colonel William Prescott, commanding the colonial forces, famously declared, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." This order encapsulated the determination and resourcefulness of the colonial troops, who understood their disadvantage in training and numbers. The British advanced, but the colonists held their fire, waiting for the most opportune moment to unleash their fury. When the British soldiers finally reached the top of the hill, they were met with a relentless volley of musket fire. The colonists fought fiercely, inflicting significant casualties. By the end of the day, over 1,000 British troops had been killed or wounded, compared to around 450 colonial casualties. This disproportionate toll shocked the British commanders and sent a message across the Atlantic. The colonies were prepared to fight for their freedom. As the battle raged, the young carpenter George, who had enlisted in the militia, found himself at the front lines, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He recalled the fervent discussions at the Green Dragon Tavern, where men had gathered to debate the course of their future. Now, with gunpowder and the cries of battle surrounding him, he realized the weight of their decisions. George fired his musket with a focus he had never known, propelled by the desire for a future free from tyranny. Meanwhile, John Hancock and Samuel Adams watched from a distance, their hearts heavy with the grim reality of war. Adams turned to Hancock, his voice steady despite the chaos. "This is the birth of our nation, John. They may take our lives, but they cannot take our spirit." Hancock nodded, understanding the gravity of their moment. The battle was brutal, yet it solidified the resolve among the colonial leaders and their followers. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting shadows over the battlefield, the British forces, despite their numerical advantage and military training, fell back. The colonists had proven their mettle, and the psychological impact of the battle would resonate throughout the colonies. News of the battle spread quickly. igniting a fire of rebellion in towns and cities where men and women alike began to see the possibility of independence. In the aftermath of the battle, the sentiment in the colonies shifted dramatically. The events at Bunker Hill served as a rallying cry. The phrase, "the shot heard round the world," which had echoed after the first skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, now took on new meaning. The realization that ordinary men could stand against the might of the British Empire fueled support for the revolutionary cause. Yet the brutal reality of war also weighed heavily on those who fought. George, though proud, returned home exhausted and haunted by the faces of fallen comrades, including men he had shared laughter with just days before. The cost of resistance began to settle in, and the excitement of rebellion was tempered by the stark realization of sacrifice. Samuel Adams and John Hancock continued to push for unity among the colonies. They understood that their struggle would not be won through mere battle victories. It required a concerted effort to unite the disparate colonies under a common cause. In the months that followed, they worked tirelessly, traveling from town to town, gathering support, and organizing committees to bolster the revolutionary effort. The battle also had repercussions for the British forces. General Howe, faced with growing dissent and rising casualties, began to realize that crushing the rebellion would not be as straightforward as anticipated. The loss at Bunker Hill, while technically a victory for the British, revealed the determination of the colonial forces. The British High Command would need to reassess their strategies and approach as they moved forward. As the summer wore on, the colonists continued to fortify their resolve. The First Continental Congress had already convened, and discussions of independence gained momentum. The leaders recognized the need for a declaration that would unify the colonies in their quest for liberty. The battle had solidified their belief that they were fighting not just for their own rights, but for the rights of all who sought freedom from oppression. By the end of 1775, the Revolutionary War had transformed from a series of skirmishes into a full-blown conflict. The ideals of liberty and self-governance began to take root in the hearts of the people. The sacrifices made at Bunker Hill were not in vain. They had ignited a passion for freedom that would not easily be extinguished. As the winter approached and the days grew shorter, the spirit of revolution persisted. In homes and taverns across the colonies, men and women spoke of the future they envisioned, a vision that would require unwavering commitment and sacrifice. They knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but the seeds of independence had been planted, and the fight for liberty was just beginning. The memories of Bunker Hill would remain etched in their minds, a testament to their courage and a reminder that the cause of freedom was worth every struggle endured. In the weeks following the tumultuous events of April 19th, 1775, the landscape of Massachusetts bore visible scars of conflict. The sun rose over the battlegrounds of Lexington and Concord, illuminating the remnants of a tragic confrontation. The fields, once fertile and vibrant, now bore witness to the blood that had seeped into the earth, a stark reminder of the struggle for liberty that had just begun. By the end of that fateful day, 8 colonial militiamen lay dead at Lexington, and the British troops, despite their superior numbers, had suffered significant losses, totaling around 270 casualties before retreating to Boston. The colonists, emboldened yet mourning, faced the daunting task of rebuilding not only their communities, but also their resolve. In the days that followed, news of the skirmish spread rapidly. Samuel Adams, who had played a crucial role in galvanizing support for the colonial cause, noted the shift in sentiments among the populace. He wrote, "The die is cast. The colonists are now united, and the spirit of liberty ignites a flame that cannot be extinguished." His words echoed through taverns and meeting halls, where men and women gathered to discuss their futures. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, a hub for revolutionary fervor, buzzed with conversations of defense and strategy. Patrons spoke in hushed tones, aware that their lives had irrevocably changed. The British soldiers, having returned to Boston, found themselves besieged, not just by the resistance of the colonists, but by their own growing isolation. Colonel William Prescott, who had commanded the troops at Bunker Hill, understood the significance of the colonial resistance. He encouraged his fellow officers, stating, "We have awakened a sleeping giant. They will fight for their homes, their families, and their freedom." The realization that the conflict had escalated into a war for independence settled heavily upon both sides. As summer approached, the colonists formed a more organized militia, drawing from the ranks of farmers, tradesmen, and laborers who had answered the call to arms. George, the young carpenter who had witnessed the chaos at Lexington, now held a rifle instead of his tools. He trained alongside fellow militiamen determined to defend his home. His resolve was mirrored in the faces of many who had never before considered themselves soldiers. However, not all were eager to engage in battle. The aftermath of violence brought sorrow and division. Families mourned lost loved ones, and communities grappled with the consequences of their choices. In the wake of the conflict, Mercy Otis Warren, a prominent figure in the revolutionary circles, penned a poignant letter lamenting, "We are a nation divided by fear and grief, yet bound by the hope of a brighter future." Her words resonated with those who found themselves torn between loyalty to the crown and a burgeoning sense of independence. The fledgling Continental Congress, convening in Philadelphia, emerged as a beacon of unity among the colonies. Delegates from various regions gathered in the summer of 1775 to address the growing crisis. John Hancock, who had been instrumental in the mobilization of resistance, took to the floor proclaiming, "We must stand united, for our cause is just and our resolve shall not waver." The assembly debated the necessity of establishing a formal military force and sought to secure alliances with other colonies, reinforcing the notion that independence was no longer a distant dream, but an urgent necessity. In the midst of this newfound unity, the hardships of war began to take their toll. Supplies dwindled, and the soldiers faced shortages of food, ammunition, and medical care. The winter of 1775 brought additional challenges, as the harsh New England climate tested the resolve of the militias. The local communities rallied to support their troops, organizing efforts to provide sustenance and warm clothing. The spirit of camaraderie among the colonists grew ever stronger, as neighbors helped one another in their time of need. As the year progressed, the conflict escalated, drawing more men into the fight. The Second Continental Congress met in May 1775, and discussions turned toward the eventual Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, whose eloquence would later shape the foundational document of the nation, began drafting ideas that would resonate with the ideals of liberty and equality. He, too, understood the weight of the moment. "Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness shall be our rallying cry," he would later declare. Meanwhile, British General Thomas Gage, tasked with controlling the increasingly restive colonies, faced mounting pressure. His reports to London spoke of the growing resistance and the challenges of maintaining authority. As Gage's forces fortified their positions in Boston, they found themselves increasingly vulnerable to attacks from the surrounding countryside, where the colonists had grown bolder in their tactics. By the fall of 1775, the conflict had taken on a new urgency. The siege of Boston, which began shortly after the battles of Lexington and Concord, became a protracted struggle. Colonial forces surrounded the city, determined to cut off British supplies and reinforcements. The once imposing British army now found itself isolated, a stark contrast to its earlier confidence. The human toll of the conflict remained profound. Families were torn apart, and the landscape of New England was irrevocably altered. The memories of those lost at Lexington and Concord became foundational to the revolutionary narrative. The battles were not just skirmishes, they were the birthplace of a movement that would demand recognition of human and respect. As winter approached once more, the resolve of the colonists was tested like never before. Yet through the grief and uncertainty, a collective determination emerged. The fight for independence had begun, and the memory of those who had fallen would inspire generations to come. The struggle was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning. In this new chapter of American history, the phrase, "the shot heard round the world," would take on a life of its own, symbolizing the moment when a disparate collection of colonies united in a quest for freedom. The echoes of that day would resonate within the hearts of those who dared to dream of a new nation, forging a legacy that would endure long after the dust of battle had settled. The events of the American Revolution, particularly the Boston Tea Party and the battles that followed, left an indelible mark on the course of history. As the years turned into decades and then centuries, The legacy of this rebellion evolved, often shaped and reshaped by the hands of historians, politicians, and storytellers. The initial fervor of liberty and self-governance would be reinterpreted, romanticized, and sometimes even distorted to serve various agendas. The narrative of the revolution became a foundational myth of the United States, symbolizing the triumph of freedom over tyranny. This mythos was crafted in the years following the war, as leaders sought to unify a disparate nation under a shared identity. Figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were elevated to near mythical status, their actions framed as heroic and their intentions pure. In the aftermath of the conflict, the 4th of July emerged as a national holiday, celebrating the Declaration of Independence and serving as an annual reminder of the hard-fought liberties that defined the new nation. However, this celebration often glossed over the complexities and contradictions of the time. While the revolution was fought ostensibly for the rights of Englishmen, many of the rights it secured were not extended to all inhabitants of the new nation. The enslavement of African Americans continued unabated, and women remained largely excluded from political participation. The ideals of liberty and equality were not universally applied, creating a paradox that would haunt the nation for generations. The mythologizing of the revolution also involved the embellishment of specific events. The Boston Tea Party, for example, was often portrayed as a spontaneous act of rebellion, a noble stand against oppression. In reality, it was a calculated political maneuver orchestrated by the Sons of Liberty, a group that included figures like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Adams himself articulated this strategy, believing that the destruction of tea would provoke a strong reaction from Britain, galvanizing support for the colonial cause. This nuance is sometimes lost in the simplified retellings that focus on the romantic aspects of the event. Over time, the Revolutionary War became a touchstone for future movements advocating for civil rights and social justice. Abolitionists in the 19th century invoked the rhetoric of the Revolution to argue for the emancipation of enslaved people. They pointed to the founding documents to emphasize that the fight for liberty must include all people. Frederick Douglass famously articulated this connection in his speeches, reminding audiences that the principles of the revolution must be applied universally if the nation was to live up to its ideals. Similarly, the suffragist movement drew upon the revolutionary spirit to advocate for women's rights. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton framed their struggle as a continuation of the fight for independence, arguing that true freedom could not exist without the right to vote. The echoes of the revolution resonated through their words, serving as both inspiration and a reminder of the work that still lay ahead. As the nation approached the centennial of the revolution in 1876, the myth of the Founding Fathers was further solidified. The Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia showcased not only the achievements of the early republic, but also a vision of America that emphasized progress and unity. It was a moment of national pride, yet it obscured the ongoing struggles faced by many groups within the country. The realities of Native American displacement, the effects of slavery, and the struggles of immigrant populations were often sidelined in favor of a singular, triumphant narrative. In the 20th century, the legacy of the revolution continued to be re-examined, especially during the civil rights movement. Activists sought to reclaim the revolutionary ideals of liberty and justice, challenging a society that had yet to fully realize those principles. Martin Luther King Jr. echoed the sentiments of the Declaration of Independence in his speeches, calling for a fulfillment of the promises made in 1776. The struggles of the past were directly linked to the ongoing fight for equality, illustrating how the legacy of the revolution was both a source of inspiration and a reminder of the work that remained. Yet, as the revolution was mythologized, it was also subject to distortion. In the late 20th century, some narratives sought to portray the founding figures as infallible, overlooking their complexities and moral failings. The romanticized versions of the revolution often glossed over the compromises made by its leaders, including their ties to slavery and the exclusion of women and non-white populations from the narrative of freedom. In contemporary society, the legacy of the American Revolution continues to provoke discussion and debate. As the nation grapples with its identity, the foundational ideals of liberty and justice are often invoked in conversations about social change. The revolution remains a powerful symbol, but it also serves as a reminder of the ongoing struggle to achieve the promises made over 2 centuries ago. The impact of the revolution extends beyond the borders of the United States. It inspired revolutions across the globe, reshaping the political landscape of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The French Revolution, for instance, drew heavily from the ideals espoused by American revolutionaries, leading to both triumphs and tumultuous consequences. The ripple effect of the events in America can be seen in the struggles for independence and self-determination that unfolded in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. As we reflect on the legacy of the American Revolution, it is essential to recognize both its triumphs and its failings. The struggle for liberty and justice is ongoing, and the ideals of the revolution serve as both a guiding light and a challenge. What we owe to those who fought for independence is not merely a celebration of their victories, but a commitment to continue the work of creating a truly inclusive society. In the quiet of our collective memory, we can hear the distant echoes of those revolutionary voices, urging us to remember the complexities of their struggle, the sacrifices made, and the ongoing journey toward a more perfect union. As we reflect on the tumultuous journey of the Sons of Liberty, we find ourselves drawn into the depths of human ambition and the relentless pursuit of freedom. These men, bound together by their yearning for liberty, faced overwhelming odds, risking everything for a cause that would ignite a nation. Samuel Adams, a key figure among them, once declared, "It does not require a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority keen to set brushfires in people's minds." This sentiment encapsulates the essence of their struggle, illustrating how a determined few can inspire a revolution. The Sons of Liberty were not merely a group of rebels. They were men fueled by love for their land and a profound desire for self-determination. Their meetings at the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, filled with fervent discussions and passionate debates, became the cradle of revolutionary thought. Here they plotted and organized, knowing that their actions could lead to severe repercussions. Yet the belief in a better future for their children drove them to act. They understood that true power lies not only in physical strength, but also in the ability to sway public opinion and gather support. However, ambition often walks hand in hand with failure. The initial successes of the Sons of Liberty, such as the Boston Tea Party, were met with swift and harsh retaliation from British authorities. The coercive acts of 1774 sought to crush their spirit, yet instead they galvanized the colonies into unity. This illustrates a fundamental aspect of human nature, our resilience in the face of adversity. When confronted with oppression, we often find within ourselves a wellspring of determination that pushes us to defy even the most formidable challenges. Moreover, this story invites contemplation on the duality of power. The Sons of Liberty wielded influence and authority in their communities, yet they were also aware of the precariousness of their position. Each act of defiance brought them closer to victory, but also deepened the risk of destruction. This tension between hope and fear is a timeless aspect of the human experience, reminding us that the pursuit of liberty is fraught with peril. As we drift towards sleep, let us carry with us the lessons learned from the Sons of Liberty, of ambition, love, and the enduring spirit of survival. Their legacy serves as a reminder that the quest for freedom is not merely an external struggle, but an internal one as well. In our dreams, may we find inspiration in their courage, allowing their story to whisper softly in our minds, urging us to pursue our own truths with the same tenacity. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the past, consider subscribing to Sleeping History Dreams for more long-form historical storytelling each week. Good night, and we'll see you in the next one.